Welcome to Inner and Outer Worlds.
It's your boy Jordan. I am alone today. The reason I'm alone is because, well, one, Zach and I tried to record this in the past, and we had the audio quality messed up. So I figured instead of getting us both in the same place again to re-record the same episode, I'll just do it on my own. And the reason for that is that this is a science episode. So focusing on the outer worlds today. What I want to talk about is essentially the most important field of science, and this covers from physics to chemistry, and then could get into a bit of biology, but we'll keep it somewhat to the basics today. And this topic that we're talking about is the atomic hypothesis or atomic theory. So in brief, that is the notion that most of nature that you experience is not just large objects or continuous liquids, but in fact, all of those objects and liquids and gases are all made of very similar things, namely atoms, which are really, really, really small particles or collections of particles that come together to produce all of the phenomena that you experience in your daily life. To aid in this discussion, I'll be working off of Richard Feynman's Feynman lectures on physics. So if you don't know who Richard Feynman is, he's my personal favorite physicist and possibly favorite scientist. He's essentially who got me into physics when I was late in high school. If you're interested in learning about science in general, definitely just search him up on YouTube, Richard Feynman, Feynman. He's got incredible lectures. Even just him sitting down in a room, just like talking about what he finds interesting is probably the coolest video you can watch. So yeah, Richard Feynman, check him out. But what I'm doing today is starting from where he starts in his entire lecture series. So he has a lecture series on all of physics. And the first introduction lecture starts with atomic theory. And I think that's a great place to start. The reason for that is, as Feynman says, quote, "If in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and any one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words?" So his answer that he gives immediately after that is, quote, "I believe it is the atomic hypothesis that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart and repelling upon being squeezed together." So Feynman says, with this, so much can be explained about our world with a bit of thinking. So that's a pretty powerful statement. You may have heard of atoms or have studied them like in high school. Maybe you're a scientist. You probably don't need to listen to this episode if you're a scientist. But it may be hard to buy into that you can explain most of our world using just this little model of little particles bouncing around, with the little caveat that when they're close together, they'll attract each other, but not too close together, because once they're too close together, they start to push back again. It might be hard to buy that can explain pretty much everything that you encounter, but we're going to kind of work towards explaining a few phenomena and maybe giving you the tools to start thinking about things in your daily life and how this simple claim can apply to those. So certain things that we'll try to explain today with atomic theory are notions of temperature, So what is hot? What is cold? Pressure. You probably have an intuitive understanding of pressure and temperature. But from atomic theory, we can more or less just derive those straight up. Related to those is heat transfer. And from heat transfer, we're going to talk about car engines. So everyone, I mean, you obviously know what a car is, but unless you're like a mechanic, you probably don't know how an engine works unless you've taken like a thermodynamics course. I definitely didn't know how they work until like third year of undergrad. So we're going to give some intuition for that. Going to talk about evaporation, the cooling of things. So for instance, why you blow on soup to cool it. And we're going to go through forms of matter. So the main ones, solid, liquid, and gas. In other episodes with Zach, we'll probably talk about other phases of matter, like plasma that exists in the sun. Maybe Bose-Einstein condensates in another episode when we talk about quantum theory. And then we're going to also just discuss some solid types. So we're going to essentially work through the phases of water. So going from liquid water to steam, which is the gas form, and to ice, which is its solid form. So that should give a fairly good understanding of the basics of atomic theory. And then I think after this solo episode, Zach and I will record a question period where he'll ask me certain things that he found interesting from this field. So because we kind of went through this in the past with the crappy audio, I do know a few of his questions. They're more related to electromagnetism, which is a layer on top of atomic theory, which when I mentioned earlier that atoms repel and attract each other, all of that's basically because of electromagnetism. So he asks a few more questions related to that. He asks about nuclear physics, which we'll get into what a nucleus is related to the atoms. That might be complicating things too much, but if you've heard of like nuclear reactors or nuclear bombs, if you've watched Oppenheimer, for instance, or the show Chernobyl, those are pretty relevant in those pieces of media. So Zach and I will talk about that topic a little bit as well. But for now, let's get to the very, very basics. So Feynman introduces this topic by getting you to imagine a tiny drop of water. So if you could do this if you have access to like a bottle of water or something, but he describes a 1/4-inch drop of water on your desk. So from our eyes, that just looks like liquid water. Okay, we're used to water being a liquid. We drink it every day. Sometimes I forget to drink enough, which isn't good. But it's just a liquid, right? Like, where are these tiny little atoms, you say, that exist in everything, Jordan? Well, let's zoom in 2,000 times 2,000 magnification on this 1/4-inch of water. That'll get us to about 40 feet, which is about the size of the room you may or may not be in right now. Still at this scale, we don't really see much of anything. It still looks like a continuous liquid. Another 2,000 times. So now we're at 15 miles. So this water droplet is now extending 15 miles in either direction. And if we pay close attention, we can see a bit of teaming. So something seems to be jumbling around. If we look really closely, we might get the notion that there's individual things going on. His analogy is that it might look like a crowd in the stadium, but viewed from like a far distance. So there's definitely individual people in that crowd, but from a far distance, it kind of looks like some coarse-grained, fuzzy thing. So to get to the actual atoms, we have to zoom in another 250 times. And at this scale, we can make out if it's the crowd of people, the individual people, but now it's just these individual atoms. And importantly, these atoms are bound together into what we call H2O, which is the water molecule. So H2O is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Hydrogens would look, I guess, smaller if you're looking at, like, if you're imagining a ball of these. So the typical chemistry diagram is like 2 tiny little balls of hydrogen attached to 1 bigger oxygen. You can look up the chemical structure of this molecule, but that's not too important. But at this scale, we'll see these molecules not just rigid, standing in place, but they'll be bouncing around, hitting each other, kind of sloshing all over the place. But they'll be close enough together that these attractive forces that we mentioned earlier are still very, very important. So the reason water behaves like a liquid is because these attractive forces are still important. So these water molecules aren't moving fast enough to completely ignore each other. Rather, they're sort of communicating with each other and organizing their behavior. So for instance, if you have a sloped surface and you drop some water on it, it will begin to flow as sort of one coherent unit. The reason is that these water molecules are sort of pulling each other along for the ride. So this is related to the notion of surface tension. If you, again, have your water drop on a table, it doesn't just spread out flat, but it sort of bubbles up. And that's because of these attractive forces between these molecules. Okay, so we're in this. Okay, so 15 miles was the 2,000 times 2,000 times magnification. We went another 250 times magnification, and we could see the molecules. So it's kind of hard to get a notion for what this huge magnification is. So the analogy for this size to keep in mind is this, and this is important, is that if you think of an apple compared to the size of the Earth, okay, just kind of do that in your head. Like an apple, very, very tiny compared to the whole Earth, right? So that's the same as an atom compared to the apple. So if you have an apple compared to the Earth, it's the same roughly as an atom compared to the apple. So keeping that scale in mind, these atoms are really, really small. There's a crap ton of them in every substance, in every drop of water in your body. And over many, many, many interactions of them, you can start to get quite complex behavior. So let's talk about temperature. So what is temperature? Actually, people didn't really know until I think the 1700s. People used to think that temperature was a substance itself. So I believe they called it the caloric. They thought that this substance moved between systems, like flowed from a hot object to a cold object when they touched, and they thought that would give an object its temperature. It turns out it's much simpler than that. That temperature is the motion of these atoms. So I said that the atoms or molecules in the water drop were moving around. They're definitely not standing still. That average motion of those molecules is directly related to its temperature. In fact, we could just say that the average motion of the atoms or molecules in a substance is the temperature. That's still loosely speaking, but just to keep it a clear image in mind, that's a very good substitution that you could make, is that temperature is the motion of these atoms. So if we make those atoms move faster, that's increasing the temperature. If we slow the atoms down, that's cooling or lowering the temperature. So let's picture, now we're still at the scale of being able to look at these water molecules. They're pretty close together. They're, again, attracting each other and moving kind of in unison. But if we heat them up or give them more temperature, they're going to start moving much faster. On average, they'll be further away from their neighbors, and they're also moving faster, so they won't have as much time to, so to speak, talk to one another or pull at each other. So they'll sort of just start whizzing past each other. And what's happening is that, let's say that water drop started at 20 degrees Celsius. If you heat up that water drop to 100 degrees Celsius, that's the transition point of liquid water to gas water or steam. And that's essentially all that's happening, is that you're giving the molecules in that liquid water drop more speed. They're whizzing past each other and not sort of sticking to each other anymore or pulling each other along for the ride. So they're kind of just behaving on their own now, and that's the gas phase of water. We could go the other way from the liquid and cool it down somehow. So that would be reducing the speed of the water molecules. And eventually, because of the shape of the water molecule, so I said that there were two hydrogens and an oxygen sort of stuck onto the ends of the oxygen, or the hydrogens. Because of some electromagnetic distribution of charges in that, again, that's maybe a bit too much detail that we want to go into right now, but you start to get these, once they're cool enough, moving slowly enough, they'll actually lock onto one another into a hexagonal crystal structure. So 6 water molecules will sort of share their hydrogens with one another and form a hexagon, so a 6-sided shape. And this will happen in 3 dimensions, and that's what we call ice. So ice is just a crystal structure of these hexagonal configurations of water molecules extending in 3 dimensions. If you picture a hexagon and then kind of make that 3D, so it's like a 3D hexagon, you'd have to look up like the crystal structure of water to actually visualize this perfectly. But what you'd notice is that there's a lot of air pockets within this crystal structure. And what's happening is that when you cool from liquid water to ice, that these little air pockets between the 6 molecules of water, those air pockets cause the ice to expand compared to the liquid. So most solids do not expand. So that's I don't want to say unique, because this probably happens in other solids, but it's a interesting quirk of ice, at least, is that it expands compared to the liquid form. So if you have a cup of water and you cool it down, it will take up more space as ice. And as far as I've heard, I think Feynman also talks about this, is that the reason that you slip on ice, So, for instance, lots of solids are not slippery. Like let's say you walk on stone or ceramic or other surfaces, they're not too slippery. Um, Potentially, as far as Feynman was discussing in one video, is that the reason that ice is slippery is because your temporary pressure that your foot's exerting on the ice causes a thin layer of that expanded ice crystal to actually melt and to decrease in its size and turn into liquid water. And then that liquid water on top of the ice is a slippery interface. So just like a little interesting addendum to this ice discussion. Someone fact check me if I'm wrong. I don't know. I'm not taking this as gospel, but I think that's definitely a plausible explanation at least. Okay, so we've established the notion of temperature as the motion of these atoms. We've talked a bit about the phases of matter, going from liquid water to gas if we heat it up, or down to ice if we cool it down. So we've kind of established the notion of heat transfer, but let's just make this really concrete. You have a really hot stove, okay? So the stove is made up of some material. Usually it's like a metal surface. So in the hot stove, the atoms are moving quite fast. So that's a high temperature. If you touched it with your fingers, the atoms or molecules in your fingers are moving much slower than the atoms on the stove. And if we zoom into the interface between the stove and your fingers, you'd see that these fast molecules of the stove are hitting the slow molecules of your finger. And if you kind of understand the laws of motion, like let's say a fast semi hits a person, God forbid, that person's going to go flying, and the semi won't change its speed too much if they're not on the brakes. You can kind of picture it like this. I mean, the atoms that are colliding here are of similar sizes, so it's not really comparable to like a semi hitting a person. But if we think about momentum, the momentum of that really hot stove compared to the slow moving atoms in your finger could be kind of comparable to a semi hitting a person, and that's going to cause quite rapid increase of motion in your finger and therefore temperature. So that is quickly picked up by your nerve signals in your finger, and you're going to react within, I don't know, a millisecond or something. I think it's really, really fast. I don't know the number. But that high temperature increase, is essentially picked up by your, I believe it's actually picked up by your, like, the nerve cells in your spine to cause you to pull away from the stove before your brain actually gets any of the signal. So this is like a really fast mechanism. But again, we're just talking about the heat transfer. So the heat transfer is just between fast moving atoms hitting the slow moving atoms in your fingers, causing them to speed up themselves. So this notion of heat transfer is basically all you need to keep in mind when you're thinking of heat transfer. Same goes for like when you're touching, for instance, a cold surface. Let's say you touch like a piece of ice. The atoms in the ice are moving slower than your fingers now, slower than the atoms in your fingers. Therefore, the ice will be taking away kinetic energy from the atoms in your fingers, and therefore decreasing the temperature. And again, your body knows how to differentiate between like a cooling sensation and a heating sensation. Okay, let's get into some Actually, okay, we're going to get into some applications of heat transfer in a sec. Let's just establish the notion of pressure. So everybody kind of has a sense for what pressure is. Like a balloon is pressurized. It's like, it feels like when you squish in a balloon, it's like pushing back against you. So that's like the pressure inside the balloon increasing and resisting your force trying to compress it. Like a basketball is pressurized. You like on an airplane, if you bring up a sealed water bottle, I'm sure you've noticed that your water bottle will actually change size because your pressure is changing as you go up in the airplane and come down, things like that. So we definitely encounter pressure quite often on a day-to-day basis. But what's going on here? So we're going to, of course, get to this from an atomic perspective. Let me just check what time we're at here. Okay, we're doing decent for time. Okay, so instead of atoms, because we can't really visualize atoms very well, let's just picture the room you're in, or if you're not in a room you've been in, and let's say there's 100 tennis balls bouncing around in this room really fast. Let's ignore gravity. In physics, we tend to ignore things we don't want to think about at the moment. So let's just picture they're just like bouncing around, hitting the walls. And yeah, so they're doing their thing. Every bounce of the tennis ball off the wall kind of, so if you throw a tennis ball at a wall, it hits the wall and flies back. If you know something about the conservation of momentum, there's something called the force that had to be exerted on the ball for it to change its speed and go the other way. And the thing is that that force takes place at the wall. So if the wall wasn't rigid, the wall would somewhat move out a bit from that collision. So in other words, the ball is pushing against the wall when it collides with it. And if you picture 100 tennis balls bouncing off the walls, that's 100 collisions hitting these walls every now and then and causing a general push or force in the direction of the wall. So if you look up like a formal definition of force, the pressure is the force per unit area. But you can more or less think of pressure as force, and just kind of drop that notion of area, just to get like a general intuition. So again, like with the balloon example, the atoms in the balloon are pushing out against the walls of the balloon. If we try to squish in the balloon, it's going to not want to do that because you're going to feel this force against your hands pushing you back outwards. So yeah, this is essentially the notion of pressure. There's more details to it than this, but for the purpose of this discussion, we'll just keep it kind of there. So we can kind of start to establish some relations of pressure to things like temperature or to the number of particles or number of these tennis balls. So we had 100 tennis balls hitting the walls every now and then. Let's say we double the number of tennis balls. Now we have twice the collisions on average, like per unit time. So that's going to cause 2 times the pressure in that system. Similarly, if we increase the speed of those 100 tennis balls, they're going to be smacking harder into the walls, and that's going to be a greater force and therefore a greater pressure in the system. So one more thing is that the walls, you could imagine, are shrinking in. So we've shrunk the room in size. So now it takes less time for a single tennis ball to find a wall. So it's going to be having more collisions per unit time. And that also will increase the pressure. So if you ever taken like a chemistry course in high school or know of the ideal gas law, this is basically what I'm describing, is that pressure, volume, number of particles, and temperature are all intimately related. So if you know like PV equals nRT, or as physicists, we do like PV equals N kBT. This is just the ideal gas law, where P, pressure, V, volume, N, number of particles, T, temperature. So there's an equation that we can understand the relation between these notions that I've been describing. That's a bit too much detail. We can kind of just ignore that, but that's just a little tidbit for people that have only taken the high school like chemistry and we're like, what the hell is an ideal gas law? Like, why does this make any sense? Like, there's just the intuition for it, to relate all these notions. So with these notions of pressure, temperature, volume, number of particles, we can actually already design an engine used in, say, like a steam engine or a car engine. So really in the like the 1800s, I don't know when like the first engine ever was created, but I believe it was maybe around the 1800s, like when trains started to be figured out. It's because people are figuring out these notions of heat and heat transfer and pressure, volume, temperature, all this stuff. So using those notions to engineer some system in reality obviously accelerates our world by a large margin. So just like having trains, having these types of engines that you can, you know, generate useful things out of it. Eventually you use these engines to make electricity in like a coal or gas power plant. So yeah, there's a lot of applications of this stuff. Let's just focus, on a car engine. I think will be like a kind of interesting application of that, and the rest we can get to either in like the question period with Zach, or we can discuss in other episodes. But okay, so what's going on in a car engine? So you can just picture so your car engine has cylinders. You've probably heard of that at least. So you can just picture like a metal cylinder with a closed bottom but an open top. Okay, so it's like a open like pop can or something, but obviously you want stronger material than just like a pop can. So it's some strong cylinder, and the top can move in and out. So that's called the piston. So what the piston can do is control the volume of the cylinder. Remember, the volume's important in this discussion. So the general notion is that you intake some gas from your tank, and you increase the volume of your piston or of your cylinder by pulling out the piston. You do what's called a compression stroke. So you have to put in a bit of work here. So this is taking some energy. Like if I was doing this by hand, I would physically have to push this piston inwards. Your car is just doing this for you, thankfully. But this is decreasing the volume, increasing the pressure in there a bit. Remember, there's some gas in there, so if you decrease volume, the pressure is going to go up a bit. And then what happens is you use your spark plug. So you spark the chemical substance that's in the cylinder right now, and that undergoes a process called combustion, which I'll explain in some amount of minutes here. But combustion is just essentially converting the energy that's trapped in atomic or molecular bonds into motion of atoms. So that increases the temperature rapidly. And because the temperature is increasing rapidly in this small space, that's going to increase the pressure very rapidly. So before the piston can even respond, that temperature and pressure has gone way, way up in the cylinder just because we applied some spark to that gas. So now you have a enclosed small space within the cylinder, very, very hot. Your piston is now free to move. So pretty quickly, that's going to cause your piston to push back out. Remember, we pushed the piston inwards, and that used some energy. But now this pulling back out of the piston is going to give us way more energy than we put in to get the piston in to the cylinder in the first place. So as a net result, we're getting a lot of energy out of this process, more than we put in. And that's what allows you to convert a dumb little liquid of gas in your car to a 200 km per hour giant metal machine rolling down the road. Just one last part of the cycle. You have to have a closed cycle in thermodynamics to get your engine like working over time. So the last part of the cycle is that once the piston's been pushed back out, it needs to cool down a bit. So there's some cooling systems in your car. There's coolant and there's air flowing through it. So the air's taking away some of that heat, and then your piston's ready to go again. So you'll apply a compression stroke, combust, pushes back out, gives you lots of energy. That spins your car's wheels, and then cools down, and that cycle repeats over and over again. So yay, we have a working car. Yeah, so that was, I mean, it's pretty recent, like this, these discoveries, and just kind of working from basic principles of, like, again, pretty simple things: pressure, volume, number of particles, temperature. Like, again, cars were invented, I guess, like in the early 1900s. Trains, like mid 1800s or something. I don't know. Train experts, hit me up. So what we've basically been discussing is the field of thermodynamics. That's like a college level thing, but now you guys are experts, so yeah, screw those college people. Yeah, so I think that's all we wanted to get into for engines. We discussed ice. Great. Okay, switching gears a bit. Let's explain evaporation. So, okay, let's picture a cup of water. Again, remember, the molecules are bouncing around, but they're quite close together, so it's still a liquid, but they're not too close together that it's ice, right? So you have some residual motion and some sloshing of these water molecules in this liquid form. If we look at the surface of that water in the cup, there will be an interface between the top of the water and the air that's just outside of your cup. So there's some air just chilling. Air is composed of different types of atoms that are in a gas phase. So it's like sparse amounts of some nitrogen molecules, oxygen molecules, CO2, stuff like that. But they're not as close as the molecules in water, so we don't have liquid air, like it's a gas. So you have some gas above your liquid water. And most of the water molecules at that surface are going to be not moving fast enough to leave into the air. But occasionally, a water molecule will get enough speed in the upwards direction that it will just whiz past its homies in the water and find itself in the air. That's basically what evaporation is that over time, let's say we have a puddle with puddles aren't too deep. They have a lot of exposure to air, like big surface area. Over time, that puddle's going to evaporate because these molecules at that surface find themselves just randomly moving in the direction of the air fast enough that they'll break free from these like attractive bonds between other water molecules. Remember that stickiness between water, liquid water. So it'll find itself moving fast enough to sort of break free from that, go into the air, and then, it can re-enter the water for sure, but it's kind of unlikely for that to happen, especially if the puddle is like open to the entire atmosphere. Once a water molecule leaves, it probably won't be rejoining the puddle. So over time, that puddle's going to disappear. We can make that process faster by, one, increasing the temperature of the water. So if we shine sunlight on that puddle, the light's giving the water molecules more energy, more speed, more temperature, and that increases the likelihood that your water will be moving fast enough to undergo this evaporation process. In other ways, we can, so if you imagine the local air above the surface of the water, because water's left the puddle and joined the air, kind of around the top of the puddle will be kind of just free molecules of water floating somewhat above the liquid water. So there'll be some like more moist water, more humid water above the puddle. And one thing we could do is kind of blow that away. So if there's wind blowing, that will remove that moist air and replace it with dry air. And that dry air will then, first of all, allow for more vaporous water to join it, but also it will reduce the likelihood that the moist water re-enters the puddle. So blowing some dry air over this puddle will also increase the speed of this evaporation. Another thing is that when we think of what happens to the puddle after a water molecule, a fast water molecule leaves it, is that on average, the molecules in the puddle are moving slower because it just lost a fast molecule. So what evaporation does is it causes the substance to cool down. So when we think of humans, you've probably heard that like we cool down by sweating. That's essentially what's going on, is we have this hot sweat that goes to the surface of our skin and evaporates. So the sweat particles, I don't know exactly the molecules, but probably water and some other stuff in there, is evaporating. So hot molecules are leaving our body, causing where it came from, our skin, to be cooler compared to what it was before. And then this leads us to the promised explanation for why blowing on your soup cools it down. It's not like the wind, like it's not like your breath is cool and your breath is causing the soup to cool down. No, it's more like the surface of the soup is cooling by this evaporative process. And we're doing that wind mechanism. So we're blowing away the moist air above the soup and replacing it with dry air. And not just dry air, but that air will be cooler as well, because it will have, the moist air has picked up some energy from the hot water from the soup joining it, and also from potentially collisions with the surface of the soup. So it'll just be, in general, a layer of hot air above your soup, and when you blow on it, it's kind of replacing that with cool and dry air. So that will cause your soup to cool down quicker. Hopefully that made some sense. I thought that was pretty cool, hearing that described. The last thing that we'll talk about in this episode. How are we for time again? 45? Okay, hopefully you guys have stuck with me. Yeah, I think this is like a reasonable amount of time. This is like a university lecture, usually around like 50 minutes, so should be done in the next 5 or so minutes. And yeah, welcome to the College of Jordan on Inner and Outer Worlds. So last thing, let's talk about combustion. So we talked about the combustion going on in your car's cylinders to give you that rapid temperature pressure increase that allows your car to give you energy and spin your car's wheels and make you go vroom vroom. Yay, it's cool stuff. So that combustion process I mentioned is a conversion of chemical energy. So that's the energy in the bonds of your atoms, and it converts that into heat or movement of atoms. So with combustion, let's first make sure we're clear on difference between atoms and molecules, which I should have explained earlier, but shit happens. So atoms are kind of like the fundamental building blocks, and you can have like an atom of oxygen, an atom of carbon, an atom of hydrogen, an atom of nitrogen, many other atoms. If you look up the periodic table, like those are the atoms. Atoms will stick together and form molecules. We've already discussed one molecule today. That's H2O. So 2 atoms of hydrogen, an atom of oxygen like to stick together and form H2O. So molecules are just like sort of structures built from atoms. Another molecule we can build is the oxygen molecule. So that's 2 oxygen atoms like to be together. They're more stable when there's 2 oxygens close together than if there's, just one separately. Fun fact, ozone, you probably heard about ozone. Ozone is 3 oxygens stuck together. That doesn't happen like most often, but it definitely can happen. So oxygen, like that you're breathing in right now, is O2, 2 oxygen atoms stuck together into one molecule. So those are happy together, 2 oxygens. However, a carbon and an oxygen, if they could be together in the molecule CO, they'd be much happier than 2 oxygens being together, or just the carbon being alone. So if possible, nature would like to rearrange itself from O2 and just like a, carbon hanging around on its own lonely. It would rather be paired up where there's the carbon and oxygen stuck to one another. Or more commonly, that carbon is already attached to other atoms. So we get what are called hydrocarbon chains, which is just hydrogen and carbon sort of stuck to one another in a chain. So if you've heard of like methane, ethane, other anes, these are just chains of these carbon and hydrogen complexes forming these molecules. So for instance, if you have a piece of wood, I don't know exactly what the molecules are in that, but it's mostly carbon attached to hydrogens. Okay, so you have a piece of wood sitting in the air, which, remember, is a lot of oxygen molecules, so O2s. So if the carbon of the wood and the oxygen of the air would prefer to be together, why doesn't your wood just like spontaneously combust, right? Like you can just keep wood, safely in your room and trust that it won't, burn your house down just randomly. So the reason for that is that when you, for instance, get the not slow because the oxygen molecules in air are moving like quite fast, but they're not moving fast enough to get close to the carbon atoms of the wood. So just picture like you have your wood. It's really just a bunch of these carbon, so hydrocarbon molecules just chilling there. Picture an oxygen molecule flying towards the wood, but it's just like room temperature. So it flies, it's not moving fast enough towards the wood. It gets close, and then it doesn't get close enough. It gets repelled and flies the other way. So nothing's happened. So that's great. Your wood's not burning your house down. So we're safe. But if we give that oxygen or those carbons in the wood enough energy, now when they get close to one another, they're actually moving fast enough that they can overcome that initial repulsion and get to this point where I mentioned they'd rather be together. They will snap together, and so they'll overcome what's called an activation energy, snap together, and that snapping together releases a lot of energy, specifically energy of motion. And specifically, if we remember from before, energy of motion increases temperature. So this is the process of combustion, is that in room temperature, the oxygen and carbons can't get close enough to do this snapping. But if we use like a lighter, or if we don't have a lighter and we rub sticks together really fast, that's putting the energy of motion from our hands into the sticks, into friction, which is increasing the speed of what the stick's in contact with. So again, this is all just heat transfer, right? It's transferring motion into other forms of motion. So heat transfer all the way down is just motion transfer. So I'm moving my hands to spin a stick, which causes the atoms that the stick's in contact with to then move faster. That's causing a higher temperature. And eventually, once it's a high enough temperature, this combustion process can start, where your carbons and your oxygens have enough speed that they can overcome repulsion, snap together, and release a shit ton of energy. Now, this is where it gets really cool, is that Remember, combustion is releasing a lot of energy, and specifically energy of motion. So what happens next is that the outgoing products from combustion, which are specifically in hydrocarbon combustion, you input the hydrocarbon, which is like methane, for instance. So CH4 is the methane molecule with some amount of ingoing oxygen molecules. So that's the input to combustion. The output, once they've all rearranged themselves, is carbon dioxide, so CO2, and water, H2O. So if you look up a hydrocarbon combustion reaction, it will tell you that the inputs are like some hydrocarbon chain, oxygen, and then your outputs are water and CO2. The thing is that the water and CO2 are coming out with a lot of speed. And what that does is that they will smash into nearby input products to combustion and cause those to move fast. And that can cause a chain reaction of this combustion. So you don't have to light each inch of your wood. You just light one part of the wood, and you trust that a chain reaction is going to occur. And that's going to cause, first of all, heat to come off of your fire. And then because of, we'll get into in future episodes, electromagnetic reasons, you get the light coming off of your fire. So yeah, this is basically, now we've gone from atomic theory with some understanding of chemical bonds. I mean, we'll get into that in more detail later. Yeah, so we've gone from atomic theory to understanding, now getting a combustion chain reaction to build, the fire that you just made while you're camping by spinning sticks together. So hopefully this was an interesting discussion. I definitely love hearing this stuff, like common daily things explained in terms of, pretty basic building blocks. Like, we haven't gone into too much detail, right? We just kind of said that there's these atoms. These atoms move around. They just have some speed. They bounce around. They attract each other sometimes. They repel each other other times when they're too close. And we've been able to do a lot with that just in like this hour-long episode. We've explained, the phases of water, explained evaporation, car engines, combustion. What else can you ask from me? But of course, there's so much more to this. Like, you can explain, again, pretty much everything you interact with, like on a day-to-day basis, just from these principles. Hopefully, like, this has given you a decent ground to think about this stuff on your own in your daily life. Feel free to comment on this on YouTube, or like send us messages wherever you can get a hold of us. We can talk more about this stuff, or hopefully I've given you some things to Google and look into yourself if you're interested. Again, Richard Feynman's fucking awesome. You should look up Fun to Imagine by Richard Feynman, or the Feynman series on YouTube. Those are just absolutely incredible, pieces of content from the GOAT. So we'll leave it at that.
What's up, guys? I got a few questions for Jordan. And before these questions, in case you're wondering, that yow sound effect is... That was good. Is, what's his name? Longhorn? Foghorn?
Redhorn Longhorn? Is that
Redhorn Longhorn.
No, that might be wrong.
Horny leg forn. From
Cornhole.
Cornhole. chicken. The hen from Looney Tunes.
Rooster.
Rooster. Sorry, he's a male.
How dare you?
It's him because the acronym for
Foghorn Leghorn.
What's it? What is it?
Foghorn Leghorn.
Foghorn Leghorn. Yeah, I thought that's what I said first.
No.
The acronym for Inner and Outer Worlds is IOW, so it's like yow. That's why.
That's it. There's not much else to it.
There's nothing else to it.
Oh, yeah.
So that's gonna be a transition of ours a lot, just so you guys are prepared. And anyways, I only have a couple questions for Jordan. I had other questions from the original time that we recorded this episode, but those are more related to magnetism.
Yep.
Sizzle my
no
nizzle,
errors.
extra salt on the frizzle. So I'm gonna save those ones for another time. But for now, Giordano, being that you talked a lot about engines in this episode, with engines, when the piston is pumping in and out of the cylinder, how is there more output energy than input energy? Is it because combustion occurs and increased temperature from CO2 creates more energy with the output?
Yeah, that's a good intuition. That's basically where it's coming from. So there's a few things, like when you study thermodynamics. Yeah, okay. So you're converting energy from like multiple forms. So there's this concept of internal energy of your system, and that can be made up of things like chemical energy, which is like the energy stored in the bonds of the gasoline, like the molecules. So there's energy stored in those bonds. If you convert those bonds to some other configuration, which you're doing in combustion, you're converting that energy out of stored bonds, which is considered a potential energy. We also call potential energy like when you have gravitational potential energy. Like let's say you have an object that you're holding off the ground that has gravitational potential energy, because if you let go, that will be turned into energy of motion or speed. So the similar concept happens with chemical bonds, is that that energy is stored up in what's called like the chemical bond. It's really an electrostatic potential energy. Like it's energy stored in the electric field.
Did you call it internal energy at first?
Yeah, so like we're looking at a system usually of like a box or a cylinder, and that system has an internal energy, which we usually use the letter U to keep track of.
Does it stand for anything?
No.
No,
I think 'cause
nothing, no Latin shit.
no, it's just like an English or whatever the alphabet's called. English alphabet character U.
Okay.
And we keep track of that in terms of different subcomponents of that internal energy, which is like the temperature, entropy, the volume, pressure. So we like decompose that internal energy into a few different subcomponents. This is getting too detailed, but anyways.
No, I want to know. I want to know why there's more output. So this is necessary
Yeah.
to
So
go
this is
into detail.
This is where it gets from. So that internal energy encompasses like your temperature of your system, but it also encompasses like the mechanical work part of your system. So like the temperature is related to this microscopic motion of particles, but then this pressure and volume term, the volume specifically, is more like macroscopic, right? Like your volume is a big piece of space.
the unit,
right? It's like this. It's the space inside the cylinder,
right?
And at a certain pressure, if you change the volume at that certain pressure, that's related to energy of work. So work and energy are equivalent notions in physics. Like they have the same unit of like joules. So when I push in the piston, I'm pushing it in at a low pressure because it's cooled down. If you remember from the episode, the compression stroke happens before any combustion, so it's at a relatively low temperature and pressure. So you can more or less imagine it to be air pressure and air temperature, just like what we're sitting in right now in this room. So if I had a cylinder in my hands and a piston, I could push that piston in, and that takes some work because that's compressing this gas that's already at some pressure, and I'm changing the volume of that. And if you do the actual like physics equations, like pressure times the change in volume is equal to the energy I've put in as work. So like I'm applying a force through some distance that is equal to work in physics. And that notion transfers directly to pressure change applied through a change in volume. So what I'm really doing is I'm converting mechanical energy,
which is the work.
Yeah, into compressing this gas into a smaller space. So I've put in some work to compress the gas into a smaller space.
And the pressure would go up because of that.
Good fucking point. Yeah, so this is where we usually draw this out on diagrams. So it's called a pressure versus volume diagram. So if you imagine, I'm sorry for those who don't really have a background in like graphs and whatnot, but I'll just describe it quickly for Zach. So if you have like your x-axis is the volume of the cylinder, and I'm starting at a large volume, so I'm like towards the right of the x-axis, and I'm compressing the cylinder
towards the right of the x-axis. You're starting.
Yeah, that's at like a high volume.
Okay.
And
you're
then
starting at high volume.
Yeah, and then I'm compressing it to a low volume, so I'm going left on the x-axis.
You're going backwards.
Going backwards.
Okay, on the graph, yes.
Yep. And then you're saying that because we're losing volume, now the pressure's going up. So you're right. So on this P versus V, pressure versus volume curve, you get this like nice curve that goes from high volume, low pressure to low volume, high pressure.
Volume is x-axis, pressure is y-axis?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're going from high volume, low pressure, along this nice curve to higher pressure, low volume now.
Okay.
And then the combustion occurs, bang, instantly, more or less. The pressure spikes up like on this graph, it's spiking up.
But the volume stays the same?
Yeah, the volume stays the same.
Okay.
So now you're at a higher point at the same volume on this graph. And now when we pull the piston back out, you get a curve that's similar to the one below it, but it's just higher on this graph. And then we cool it down very quickly. So now it's at the starting volume, which is a high volume. And we cool it down, so we're decreasing the pressure again, and that completes a loop on this P versus V diagram.
What's cooling it? Just the air around it naturally cools?
Yeah, the air that's passing through your like car's grills, and then like there's coolant flowing around the engine and stuff. So it's like you're basically stripping away heat now because you need to complete that loop on this pressure versus volume diagram.
And when it cools, it can return back to the original pressure?
Yep.
And then
the original pressure and volume
through again and again.
Yeah. So you're in this P versus V space, you're starting at that pressure and volume, and then you're going around a loop in this pressure and volume space on this graph.
Yeah.
It's not like physical space, it's this graph.
I encourage, if anyone has a notepad with them right now and you're not driving, to draw this Something that really helped me as Jordan was speaking throughout this episode earlier on is writing down or drawing everything that he's talking about. I think most of us are visual learners, and note taking gets annoying, but like if you actually draw stuff out as he's explaining, it helped me a lot. And if you can right now, with the graph thing that he just explained, pressure versus volume, draw that out. It makes it way easier to understand. The only reason I could understand what he was just saying right now is because he's using his hands to show how this graph is going, but obviously you can't see that right now. We don't have a camera, so yeah, draw that out if you want to understand that. But yeah, it does make sense.
Okay, so
how this cycle keeps going.
Yeah.
Piston goes in and out. It cools when the pressure's gone, and
so
coolant
let me-
and the surrounding
Yeah,
air.
let me
cool it
wrap
down.
this up with like what the answer to your question. So you asked like why we're getting
More output
more
than
output.
input energy.
So remember I said the work or the energy that we get is so the energy I put in is this low pressure times the change in the volume, roughly. So the volume changed from like open cylinder to like the closed position. So that's a change in volume at this low pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But now we've jumped upwards in that curve to higher pressures because of the combustion. So now when we pull out the piston, we're going through the same change in volume, but at a much higher pressure. So that's basically, we have more pressure, we have more force in the system that is now pushing outwards on this piston
Mm-hmm.
and giving us much more energy
so
than we had put in the first
the
place.
combustion, yeah, that's basically what I said. The combustion occurring spikes the pressure, which increases the output energy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're basically, it all comes down to converting microscopic. So we're first converting the energy of microscopic bonds into microscopic motion. But then, this is like the key thing in thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, is that we have microscopic particles or atoms just flying in random directions. But what we're doing in our engine is we're converting that into one direction of output energy, which is in the direction of the piston. So because of that, we're never going to be able to extract all of the energy from our thermodynamic systems. There's like certain laws in place. Like if you look up the Carnot cycle or Carnot engine, that's like the maximum efficiency an engine can be. And it depends on basically the temperature of your hot like engine and then your coolant. So you could get a very efficient engine if you had infinite heating and like absolute zero cooling. But you'll never really get that in reality.
So temperature is the reason why there's the loss of energy? Temperature fluctuations? Or what is the purpose that it's inefficient, or we'll never be?
No, it's
perfectly
purely
efficient?
because the motion of the particles is just in random directions.
Oh, okay.
Like we can't harness every single particle's energy in this engine
right.
because it's all just in random directions. So we're just doing like the best we can and like extracting one directional component of that, more or less. But yeah, so the crux of the question is that we're converting microscopic bonds to motion into a macroscopic motion, so like large scale motion. And that's what's spinning, well, pushing your piston out and then like spinning your wheel shaft and whatnot.
Right. And so the chemical bonds being broken apart during combustion releases energy from what those bonds had
Yeah.
internally. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so there's energy stored between these atoms in the molecules, and once you're able to like provide them another more stable option, which is the CO2 and H2O, like water output from combustion, it
Mhm.
would rather be in that state. And it basically, if you imagine like the energy being like on top of a hill, it's going to fall down the hill into a more stable state. Like falling down the hill is like the combustion process.
Mm.
And then when you roll a ball down a hill, you're getting speed out of it. So that
Right.
speed goes into the output products.
Okay.
So if you imagine, remember I said gravitational potential energy, you have energy stored in the gravitational field. Like that's the ball on this higher hill. And then we're dropping the ball down the hill into a lower hill. It's a similar concept with this electric or chemical potential energy, is we're
Okay.
converting the so-called hill of chemical bond energy into motion
Right.
from the output products. Yeah.
And those bonds breaking and the energy being released is what spikes the pressure.
Yeah, because remember, back to the episode, if you have all the tennis balls in the room and you start throwing them faster now, then you're getting harder collisions with the walls. So it's the same number of tennis balls.
Pressure goes up.
Yeah, it's the same number of tennis balls in the room, but now you're getting more collisions per unit time and like faster collisions, so like harder with the walls.
Yeah.
So that's a spike in pressure and temperature.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good explanation.
Thanks.
Long but good. And then
Yeah,
Number
sorry for
2.
the rambling, those
Good.
listening, but I think hopefully some people like that amount of detail, but I know it can be a bit too much, so we'll keep it to the point.
It's good.
Yeah.
Okay, second question and final question for tonight. Is combustion always a result of carbon and oxygen combining? Could it result from any other atoms combining?
So I don't know if combustion is reserved for like carbon. I mean, I don't think this is the case because we call it hydrocarbon combustion. So maybe combustion is just a more general term for exothermal reactions where it's like releasing heat. I don't remember the exact nomenclature surrounding it, but for instance, jet fuel is hydrogen mixing with oxygen to put out water and a fuck ton of energy. So that's no carbon in that and I would call it a combustion reaction, but again, I don't know if this is misuse of the word. So it could be. I don't know the exact like use of the word combustion, but there's definitely conversion of chemical bonds into energy of motion at the very least, and whether that's called combustion or not, it doesn't really matter. Like it's just the physical notion of
Shit igniting.
Shit like igniting, and
On
typically
fire.
you get like some sort of like light show coming out of it, which we call fire. Like when a rocket is, you're not thinking of the hydrogen and oxygen and water output from a jet or from a like a rocket ship, but
I was
like
gonna say,
you just see the fire.
right.
Yeah.
Is water falling down beneath the jet? If water
Yeah, I
is
mean,
the output?
As far as I know, yeah. I
ain't never seen no water droplets coming off of a
no,
fucking-
that's it's I'd have to see like what the current rocket technology and whatnot is, but for
And I would
sure
be curious how much water, if there is water, if that's the output molecule, then
yeah.
okay, cool. But like how much is coming off of it and where and
Yeah, I mean, we can look into this. We can literally look this up right now. But
He does not have all the answers, guys. I don't know about this guy. Some scientist.
you
Just
mother.
kidding.
I'm not a fucking
Yeah.
rocket scientist.
He's hurt.
Fuck
He's
you.
hurt by these fucking words. Mr. NASA
Yeah.
isn't a rocket scientist.
Do you want to talk about nuclear physics right now, or save it?
I think save it unless I have an actual question exactly about it. Going back to my old questions. Oh. Don't leave the room. Oh, he's getting our pizza. Good. He can leave the room for that. Pizza here? Oh, yeah, guys. Celebration. The best pizza in Vancouver. What's it called again? AJ's Pizza. Look at that cold marinara on top of a hot pizza with some hot sauce inside of the pizza and some hot cheese. There's some fucking amazing temperature balance they got going on with this shit here. Anyways, guys, highly. Oh no. Wow. Wow, he just fed me a bite, guys. And I have to say, this is better than I expected, even. AJ's Pizza, Vancouver. 325 East Broadway. 604-428-5805. For all you people in Vancouver. Oh my god, the sauce. Wow. 10 out of 10,
All right.
guys. 10 out of 10.
Any more questions?
So, wow, that basil in there too? Fuck me. Guys, AJ's. Make it happen at some point in your life. So, when we originally recorded this, I was asking you about the space between particles and the space, or like what space is made of, like vacuum fields or space foam or whatever the fuck they call it. Is it the same stuff in particles?
In particles? So for the most
The
part,
space inside an atom
oh, I see.
between the outer perimeter of the atom and the nucleus. Or wait, what did you call that again? Energy
Like
level?
a wave function?
Energy level is the
Yeah, like those are typically called the
Perimeter?
wave functions, like the atomic wave functions describe where the electrons are found around the atom. So like you could call that like a perimeter, I guess, but technically it's more like a probability of where the particle is.
right.
But yeah, like you can picture it as empty space.
But I want to know what that empty space is.
Well, that's a hard problem in general to know what empty space is. So we know that empty space has like the existence of these like quantum fluctuations and whatnot, where like particles can pop into and out of existence, where like other particles can travel through. Like the electron and the nucleus of the atom are communicating with each other via like the electric field or photon interaction. So like light is basically flying between them to communicate with one another.
Wait. Between the nucleus and the electron, photons are flying between each other
Yeah, so
to relay information?
yeah. So when not we, because like I didn't do anything, but when physicists first developed like electromagnetism, they kind of like postulated that there's this field that goes out through space, that charges can like know the presence of other charges and move accordingly. So
Is this like a quantum field of some sort?
no, just before they knew what quantum mechanics was at all, they basically just said, okay, we have a positive charge, which is the nucleus, or like it's the protons in the nucleus.
Yeah.
And anywhere in space, if another charge exists, it will feel that electric field. If it's a negative charge somewhere in space, it will feel that as an attractive force, so it'll like move towards it. If it's another positive charge out in space, it will feel it as a repulsion and move away. So that's like kind of just what people came up with as like a model for these behaviors.
I thought though, atoms from a distance will be attracted to another atom because the negative electrons in that will be attracted to the positive protons in a nucleus of another atom, but then when it gets too close to that atom, then the protons of the nucleus of the new atom coming in will repel off of the protons of the
Yeah, actually,
present atom.
I think the repulsion happens from the electrons of the respective atoms not wanting to be in the
not the
same
protons.
states. Yeah, so that happens before
So
the nucleus.
but that happens after an attraction starts happening, and then it gets too close, and then the
Yeah, so like
repulsion will happen.
we're still like that's too like even thinking of atoms interacting with other atoms, that's like too much detail to like understand the real phenomenon.
Well, what the fuck?
Because atoms have non-trivial like structure, right? So like an atom itself has a proton or more in the nucleus and an electron or more electrons around that nucleus. So that has some structure, and how that interacts with another atom with structure is not an easy problem to solve. So even just looking at one atom is like already a lot of detail. And I mean, we can talk about interactions between atoms, but you're already like growing the space of things we could talk about, which is fine. I'm just saying it like things aren't as cut and dry when you get to that level, but things are more cut and dry when you have like one particle, like a proton, interacting with another particle, electron, to form like a hydrogen atom. And then we could talk about how those particles interact with one another. And even that's very complicated.
You were starting to make it sound simple, and now you say that's complicated too.
Yeah, it's all always
Guys.
complicated for sure. Yeah. But in terms of like the
These
empty
questions
space,
are too much.
yeah. Depends how much detail you want to go into.
No, we have pizza to eat.
Yeah.
So, do you have anything else to wrap up that idea with?
No, I mean we'll get into like full on episodes with to outline this stuff. I think it's too much to just jump into these notions like in much detail without first outlining like the basics of electromagnetism, the basics of like quantum physics, the basics of other stuff. So
I really have to try and resist then after what you just said, what I wanted to ask next.
wait, what
Because
is it?
If we need to lay out a baseline before we get into these quantum things, then maybe this is the worst question to ask right now. But what is the Higgs field? What's a Higgs boson? That's a quantum field, right?
Yeah, it's a quantum field, and it's essentially, as far as I understand, the boson or like particle that gives other particles their mass. So other particles are
It's
always
the only particle that gives particles their mass.
yeah, as far as I understand.
Oh,
so
shit.
it's like if a particle is more massive, it's interacting more with the Higgs field and is getting like caught up in the Higgs field, so to speak. The analogy they make to like explain this to the masses is like, let's say I'm a nobody and I'm in a crowd of people. That's like, let's say it's a relatively like sparse crowd of people, but there's still a lot of people around, right? I can more or less weave my way through that crowd and like get through and not too much trouble. But let's say you're a really famous celebrity and you go through this crowd, you're going to start like attracting all these people like coming up to you, and they're going to slow your progress. So that's like the similar analogy is that like you have more mass and I have less mass. Is like it's like harder for you to move through this field and to like pick up energy.
You could have just used the analogy of like a larger person. Dare I say fat person.
Yeah, but the thing is you want to like move through the crowd.
Because they have more mass, so it's like tougher to squeeze through.
Yeah, maybe they were just trying to be like polite in the online video. But for our sake.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, there you go. So, yeah. But
okay, so
we'll get into a lot of cool science stuff in more detail for sure. Just like, yeah.
So a Higgs boson is one of the many quarks or subatomic particles that create electrons and protons and neutrons. Is that correct?
I would say creates the wrong word. I would say it like supports their existence.
Okay. It's comprised partially of Higgs bosons,
like
plus other subatomic particles.
What
a neutron or a proton or an electron, they're all partially comprised of Higgs bosons plus other subatomic particles.
So the Higgs boson's particularly tricky because that is its own particle. So an electron is its own particle. It's not made up of anything else.
Oh, right. It's
a proton is...
It's a lepton, right?
Yeah. A proton is made up of 3 quarks, but those quarks themselves are not made up of anything else. And then a neutron is also made up of 3 quarks, but those quarks themselves aren't made up of anything. So they're called like
Which
fundamental.
Quarks are they?
For the proton, it's 2 up quarks and 1 down quark.
Oh, right. So then where the fuck does the Higgs come in?
Yeah, so that's where it's like I'd have to
this
research
is trippy,
this.
guys. We're entering trippy
So
territory.
the particles, as far as I understand, they're not made up. Like the Higgs boson is not inside of them per se, but they interact.
But it's giving it mass.
Yeah, they interact with the Higgs field as they're just like existing, and the Higgs field interacts via the Higgs boson with the particles. It's quite complex stuff, but
the more I learn, guys, the crazier this place is.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we'll get into particle physics. We'll get into quantum physics, nuclear physics, lots of physics.
Excellent.
And it'll be fun time.
I'm glad we're doing this because I was so lazy about learning this stuff on my own. But now that we're forced to talk about it on this podcast and share it with you all, I'm learning a lot.
I hope so. Yeah.
Suddenly I'm actually paying attention when Jordan talks science.
Okay, so the reason I don't just like jump into so much detail is because it's a lot to take in at first. Like I trust that you're smart, and I think you're smarter than you even realize you are. It just takes some time to get used to notions and to release yourself from biases of other notions. Like the other day we were talking about electricity and like the difference between electricity, electromagnetism, electric field, electric charge. Like there's just all these like names and English things getting in the way that's like we just need to slowly like build up and not get confused in like the language, you know?
We should have a full episode about that and those distinctions, by the way, because
we can.
I did ask those to Jordan last time we tried to record this episode, but because the audio was messed, we're just going to talk about that stuff another time. But it's a valuable conversation. It's good to know the difference. I did not know the difference between electromagnetic things and electronics and...
Yeah, there's a lot of like words and buzzwords that like pervade our psyche and stuff. Like it's just like we're so used to the term electricity. We're so used to the term electronics. Like we don't even know what they mean for the
No.
most part. So it's like
I just thought it was like electricity, and then that's a whole umbrella word, and all those things fall beneath it. And like electromagnetic would just be like a Venn diagram of like electricity and magnetism
yeah, and like
coming
to
together.
some extent that's correct, but it's just like establishing what's what is really important to then like move on from it, and we'll definitely outline things for you and for people
Yeah.
to not get confused in it. My goal here, like I hope it was clear somewhat from the first episode, like from this episode, but like when I was doing it on my own, is that I want to give people the tools to like feel like they could have discovered this stuff on their own almost, or just give like
Dang.
the full intuition that this makes a lot of sense. Now let's like move on from there.
Yeah.
Because
It was a very basic lecture that you gave, and I think most people and even monkeys would be able to understand.
Yeah,
So
I mean-
you got very basic, and it was a good thing because then now we can build on that foundation.
yeah, the kind of idea is to like have it basic, but also contain some cool information that like you feel like it wasn't just like a trivial waste of time.
Yeah, no, I still learned something. I still learned a lot.
That's the goal, is to like balance that where
It shows like my understanding of this was like below monkey before I
yeah, I want you to
listened
feel
and then
smart.
now
I want
it's
you
like
to feel
on
smarter
par
than
with
monkey.
monkeys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. See, you probably haven't felt that in your whole life. So you're fucking living it up now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now monkey eat pizza.
Yeah,
right.
excuse us, guys. These
Outro
monkeys
us.
got some za to eat and beers to drink. Thank you for joining us. We will catch you on the flippity.